With the release of Alliance Insight, the metagame has definitely shifted. If you haven't checked out my top 10 meta decks for the new Alliance Insight format already, you can do so. It's going to be linked in the description where I'll talk about some of the best decks going into the format. But what about everything else? In this video, I'll be talking about all the other decks that I think are worth talking about, even though they aren't necessarily going to be at the forefront of the metagame. So if you guys enjoyed this type of content, then be sure to let me know by leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing for the YouTube algorithm. But without any further ado, let's get straight into it. Starting off first with explanations of the tiers, the first one being can compete with meta. I think that these decks are just below like the top tier decks and can have the potential to actually beat them somewhat consistently, whether it's because of the way the deck can be built with like a lot of hand traps, or maybe just its end board is very hard for the top decks to crack. Next up are fine for regionals. I think that these decks are still fairly competitive, but you probably need either a very talented pilot or you need to have a bit of luck go your way in order to do well at a bigger tournament like a regionals. Next up is fine for locals. I think that these decks are still okay, like they're workable, and you could take it to a locals and probably do well against most of the other decks you see there, since most of the time there aren't going to be as many top tier competitive decks as you might expect at a larger tournament. And then finally, stay home instead. I think that you may as well just not waste your time going to a tournament with any of these decks in this tier and just stay home instead. With all that being said, let's hop straight into it, starting off with the new decks that have just come out of Alliance Insight. The first one being Heraldic Beast. I think that Heraldic Beast is something that actually might be able to work at a regional level. The Heraldic Beast stuff is a very cool sort of rank 4 spam deck, and they did get one of the most powerful new extenders and starters for the deck being sort of like a Heraldic Beast circular. Although that being said, there are some restrictions on the Heraldic Beast cards. I believe they lock you into either Heraldic Beast XYZ monsters or number XYZ monsters, so you aren't going to be able to do nearly as much as like a pure Ryzeal deck would. I think that maybe there's some sort of experimentation that can be done just because of how powerful some of the new Heraldic Beast extenders can be. Next up is adding Nister, and like this is the pure version without any mouse cards. I think that adding Nister as a deck before we got this set was kind of interesting. It wasn't that good. It ended on like a Towers monsters and one like soft negate, and it really isn't good enough to stand up to like the current metagame. But with the new support, I think that they do have a new way you could sort of take the deck. You could sort of play it as sort of generic cyber slop. The added Nister cards are definitely good at generating bodies on the board, and with so many new powerful cyber toolbox extra deck monsters, decks like Allied Kotalker adding Nister, for example, the deck could have some direction to go now that isn't just the Towers Turbo. Because of how strong the new adding Nister support is and how strong generic cyber stuff has gotten over the years, it actually probably is a fine deck for regionals in my opinion. Next up is Ancient Fairy, and unfortunately I think that this deck is probably not one worth considering at all. I was reading over the cards and I wasn't super impressed by most of them. I don't really see how this deck is going to consistently win games, and as a result, I think that unless someone is able to find some crazy engine to put into this deck, I don't really think this deck's going to do enough to be able to compete with any of the meta decks out there. Next up is Regenesis, and Regenesis is interesting because Regenesis isn't typically going to be used as a pure deck. It's more likely going to be played as an engine, so it makes it kind of hard to categorize. But I would say that the Regenesis engine for now is probably fine for like a local setting. It is a bit slow at times, and the playstyle of the deck does require you to have like some very powerful like supplementary engine, so maybe something like the Kashtira cards could push this deck to be a little bit more competitive. But I think for now, the engine is a little bit too slow and almost a little bit too fair, I would say. It just can't really keep up with like the fast-paced metagame that I think we're going to be in for the Alliance Insight format. So I'll probably say it's a fine deck for locals. Similarly, I think that Dragon Rulers are also going to be okay for locals. Don't get me wrong, the new cards are incredibly strong, and Dragon is actually quite close to Cybers in terms of how much generic slop there is for the Dragon decks. But I think that the problem with Dragon Ruler is that there's going to be a lot of overlap, unfortunately, that's going to hit this deck. This deck is probably going to lose very hard to commonly played cards like the Mulcharmies, and may struggle into a card like Lantia as well, which people are definitely going to be playing for the Malice deck. So I think that while the Dragon Ruler power level is on the same, is similar to like Heraldic Beast and adding Nister, I think that there's just too many cards that also hurt Dragon Rulers that people are going to be playing anyways. So it may be really difficult for Dragon Rulers to do well at a larger tournament. But I do think that the cards are pretty cool, and I think that there is some potential because of how well supported the dragon type is. Next up is Ryuji, and I think Ryuji is maybe like at the top of Stay Home Instead and bottom of Fine for Locals. They did get some new support, and I think the new support is good, but I just really don't think it's going to be enough to push this deck like anywhere near close enough to be super competitive. Like, it'll probably function as an okay deck now, but I just don't know if it'll be able to consistently beat many other decks because of how clunky and weird the cards are. Next up is Evil Twin, and they did just get a new Link 1 monster in their deck, and I think that this might actually be enough to push the Evil Twin deck to something that can compete with the metagame, just because of how powerful the Fiendsmith engine is and how splashable it is in this deck. There are some light fiends in the Evil Twin deck that they get access to naturally. They'll be able to slot really well into the engine of Live Twin and their combos anyways, because they have very accessible light fiends. I still think Fiendsmith is going to be a very strong engine, even though it won't be played in the best decks. Evil Twin is one of those decks that can still take advantage of it, and not to mention, I think that the Evil Twin deck also has enough like flexibility where there's some experimentation to be done with like the sprite cards, the runic cards even. Because of that, I just feel like the Evil Twin deck, there's some potential for it to actually be experimented on, and people might find a way to actually make this deck competitive with the metagame. So I'll put it up here for now. Next up is Pure Mitsurugi, and I think Pure Mitsurugi is probably going to go at the top of Fine for Regionals. Like, the new Mitsurugi cards we got might be like some of the best like Wave 2 support for TCG exclusives that I've seen off of like recent memory. But unfortunately, I just feel like the Mitsurugi cards, like as a standalone deck, just don't do enough. Like, the cards are good, but I feel like it needs like one little extra push, like the Ryzeal engine, to actually bring it to the forefront of the metagame. As a ritual deck, you are inherently disadvantaged with being forced to use like a spell to like summon like your main boss monsters, and you are forced to sometimes play like weird clunky cards like ritual spells that don't necessarily work with every hand. So I think that is something that will hold the Pure Mitsurugi deck back. It just simply doesn't have that like same consistency and power level as like the Ryzeal Mitsurugi deck would have. So as a result, I think that maybe Pure Mitsurugi will have to adopt more of like a slower control-y style and ultimately lower its ceiling by quite a bit without playing the Ryzeal cards. So for that reason, I think it'll probably just be an okay deck that maybe can do well at a regional level. Alright, so that's going to do it for the deck that got a new support in Alliance Insight. Now we're going to talk about pretty much everything else that I think is going to be worth talking about and relevant. First one is Goblin Bikers. Goblin Bikers is probably something that's fine for locals. I think Ryzeal is still going to be a solid deck, and of course Goblin Bikers is able to take advantage of its good matchup into Ryzeal, but I don't think Ryzeal is going to be the same dominant force that it was in our previous format. Goblin Biker isn't going to bump into its best matchup of Ryzeal that often anymore, and outside of the Ryzeal matchup, I think that Goblin Bikers are just a fine mid-rangey combo deck, like nothing too crazy. So for that reason, I'll probably just put it at fine for locals. Next up is Labyrinth, and I think Labyrinth might get a little bit worse in this upcoming format because Malice is going to be the best deck. The reason why Malice specifically is bad for Labyrinth is because they do play cards like Dominus Impulse, which are able to shut off a lot of the Labyrinth engine, and they have a very accessible Link 1 in Linkuriboh that's able to trade very well with the Labyrinth back row. So I think that Labyrinth's going to struggle a lot playing into the Malice decks, but outside of that, I think it's still a competent deck. You can put in a bunch of good generic normal traps like Equation Cannon, and that can be very hard for a lot of decks to deal with. So I think that Labyrinth is still probably going to be a deck that's fine for regionals, although I would say it does definitely get a little bit worse because of how popular I think Malice is going to be. Next up is Branded, and I think that Branded is something that's probably also okay for regionals, maybe like at the bottom of fine for regionals, top of fine for locals. The deck is still okay, like it's still decently powerful. There are still ways to, I guess, lock out your opponent with Albion, with like the Transcendent Dragon, giving them some like bad monster that they don't want on their board. But even outside of that, I think that Branded still has a solid enough grind game. Mirror Jade is still a very powerful monster, but I think that Branded is a little bit dated at this point. And similarly as Labyrinth, Malice is going to be the best deck. They're going to play Dominus Impulse, and that's just 3 more ways to stop your Branded fusion. So I think that unfortunately Branded faces a similar problem as Labyrinth in that it does sort of just get pwned by Malice every time it goes up against it, especially because Branded and Labyrinth also just don't have the most room to play non-engine as well, so it'll be really hard to play into Malice going second. Next up are Sharks, and Sharks did lose Bahamut Shark in our last ban list, and I think that as like a pure deck without any of the Ryzeal cards, it's probably something I would say is like okay for locals. Like as a rank 4 like spam deck, it's fine, but losing Dweller and Bahamut being some of the most powerful rank 4 waters that we have ever seen in the game. Just makes it so Shark just loses a lot of its power level, in my opinion. And especially if you're not supplementing it with the Yugioh cards, I just feel like there aren't enough like good Shark monsters to really have a consistently powerful deck that's able to play through a lot of interaction. If you do choose to play Yugioh in it, it probably is still around the same, in my opinion. It does help a little bit, but at that point I'd probably just a better Yugioh variant to play instead of Sharks. So I'd probably put it at like the very top of fine for locals, and maybe on a very good day bottom of fine for regionals if someone like Jesse Cotton's playing it. Next up are Plants. I think Plants is a deck that's probably still fine for regionals. It's still a very scary combo deck when it goes first, and its end board is still very difficult to break. But I feel like the problem with Plants is that it just has a very large engine size, and as a result, it's either going to have to go over 40 in order to play a larger number of non-engine, or just isn't going to be able to play that much non-engine as well. So it's going to be one of those combo decks where it's great going first, but will just struggle going second, in my opinion. So for that reason, I'll probably just put it in like fine for regionals. There are also some like weird engine requirements in this deck that aren't that good, so I feel like for that reason, it can't really go higher than this. Next up are Salamangreat and I guess Marincess, sort of these like mid-rangey cyber stacks. I think that these are probably fine, like a very like close to the bottom fine for regionals. The reason I say that is because these decks have a lot of room for non-engine, so they can play a ton of hand traps, which does give them a better chance into decks like Malice, and gives them the potential to actually be able to stop them from actually being able to play the game. They don't do anything too crazy, so their ceiling is relatively capped, but in terms of like non-engine space, I think it's pretty solid. And of course, a deck like Salamangreat is also going to have access to like powerful generic extra deck Cyber monsters, so I think that is also something that it has going for it. I guess while we're on the topic of like generic cyber stuff, I also think that Mathmech is probably going to be a deck that's like fine for regionals as well. It is, I think, a step above like the Salamangreat and Marincess, because Circular is just such a powerful card, and does feel like its end boards can be a little bit more oppressive than something like Salamangreat or something like Marincess, since they don't really have any locks outside of locking you out of a Cybers. So I think that some Mathmech builds are going to be able to raise their ceiling a lot by playing a lot of the extra deck Cyber slot monsters, so decks like cards like Allied Code Talker at Ignister, for example, and the rest of the Code Talkers. It, of course, does have weaknesses. It probably is going to suffer a lot into commonly played hand traps like the Mulcharmies, and of course, Bystials are still a thing, and that can hurt Super Factorial a lot. So I don't think that Mathmech can really go higher than fine for regionals, but outside of that, Mathmech and the other mid-range Cyber decks are probably fine. Next up is Fire King. I think Fire King is also a deck that like I would put at maybe the bottom of fine for regionals, like top of fine for locals. I really do think you need a very good pilot in order to do all of this. Like, the cards are fine into a deck like Yugioh because they do capitalize off of Detonator being like Yugioh's main disruption. But I just feel like into a deck like Malice, this deck's just not going to be able to do too much going second. Like, Malice just has so many ways to remove cards from the graveyard as well as the field by banishing them, and Fire King's just going to struggle a lot going into that. Fire King, outside of that though, is probably okay. It would probably be playable into pretty much every single matchup outside of that. So for that reason, I'll probably put it at fine for regionals. It's still a fairly competitive deck, but I just feel like it won't have a super great Malice matchup. Next up is Ritual Beast, and I think unfortunately for Ritual Beast, it'll probably just have to go at the top of fine for locals. It just gets caught in the crossfire with a card like Artifact Lancia, and it is really annoying for them to deal with cards like Dominus Impulse and the Mulcharmies as well, which are going to be flying around in this metagame a ton. So I think that Ritual Beast is something that I wouldn't really recommend playing this current format, just because of how much like the commonly played staples are going to hurt it. But maybe in the future, when those cards sort of phase out of the metagame, this deck can come back. It's still a very strong combo deck, but I just feel like right now it's going to be an uphill battle every time you play it. Next up is Centurion. I think that Centurion is a deck that's like okay for regionals. It sort of has like the similar strengths as like the mid-rangey cyber stacks. A couple of decent one-card combos that set up their like mid-rangey end board. It's able to play a ton of hand traps, but it sort of suffers the same problem in the sense that it can't really go second with its engine. Like, if you don't see the right hand traps or enough hand traps, your engine is never going to be able to play through any sort of end board at all. So I think that for that reason, it's probably just going to be fine for regionals. If you win a lot of die rolls, I think you'll probably do fine with these decks, but I just don't feel like these types of decks can very consistently compete with the metagame. Next up is Dynamorphia. Dynamorphia is something that's interesting because there's some world where set 5 pass could be decent into a lot of the top decks. I think it may be a little difficult into a deck like Malice, since they do have Allied Code Talker, they do have 2 banishes in the regular combos that can just essentially nullify like 3 out of their 5 back rows right off the bat. I do feel like against a lot of other decks, just setting 5 and like even when going second, is not going to be the worst thing in the world. These monsters are very annoying to deal with, and a lot of decks just don't really have great ways to out a Rex turn when it's on the field. I will say that this deck is kind of held back by the time rules, and especially at a bigger tournament where players are going to use every advantage that they can get, it's going to be very difficult to play a deck like Dynamorphia, I think, and do super well, because most opponents are just going to recognize that, oh, hey, if I end up stalling out the game for a little bit longer and they can't do any damage to me, then they're just going to end up losing because they have to pay life points during their regular combo and do not really have a way to gain them back. So I think that while Dynamorphia is a fairly powerful deck, I don't think that it's going to be able to consistently do well at a big tournament. Next up is Dragon Link. I think these decks are like okay for locals. Dragon did get some buff with like Wyvern Buster and Collapse Serpent coming back to 2, but I feel like in terms of its power level, it just doesn't feel that high anymore. Not to mention the Bestial monsters aren't going to be nearly as high impact as they were in some previous formats. So I think that the Dragon Link decks just lose out a lot of their appeal as well, since they were able to play a large Bestial count as part of their engine and have it actually be like meaningful hand traps into decks was one of the biggest strengths that Dragon Link had, in my opinion. And now that the Bestials aren't that good, I just don't think that Dragon Link's going to be super competitive. Next up is Sprite, and I think Sprite is actually a deck that can compete with the meta consistently. It's almost like a level 2 Ryzeal in some sense, where they're able to just put a body on board, eat up like a low impact hand trap like Imperm or Valor, and then just summon another body and just continue generating advantage, and then threatening a card like Gigantic Sprite to just pop off and prevent a card like Nibiru from even activating in the first place. Gigantic Sprite is almost like Ryzeal Duo Drive in that sense, in where if it resolves, they just generate so much advantage and follow-up, it's going to be very hard to beat them. I also think that Sprite's engine is fairly compact, is able to play a high number of non-engine, which is very good, of course. And one other thing that Sprite has going for it is Mannequin Cat. Mannequin Cat is actually low-key one of the nastiest cards in the game, because it's able to cheat out so many boss monsters that just have no business being on the Sprite end board. Like, for example, against Malice, they can cheat out Chaos Hunter anytime they special summon a Dark Monster. Against any other graveyard deck, they can cheat out at the end of Anubis. And then even against a deck like Blue Eyes, they can cheat out a card like Archlord Christia. And some of those boss monsters are almost impossible for those decks to out without like very specific non-engine cards. So I think that Sprite has a ton going for it, in my opinion. And for that reason, I'll probably put it at like can compete with meta. I actually think that this could be like a off-meta pick that has some potential, solely because of how strong a card like Mannequin Cat can be in the right matchups. Next up are Heroes. I think Heroes are probably at the top of fine for regionals. Like, the deck is still pretty crazy going first. It has a ton of extenders, but my problem with Heroes has been a similar problem as with Plants. It just doesn't have the most room for non-engine, and while its engine itself is a lot better at breaking boards than a deck like Plants, I don't feel like the boards in the upcoming Alliance Inside format are going to be able to be broken with just engine alone. Your engine will have to do something incredibly crazy to be able to crack like the Malice end board when they go off. And I think most of the time Heroes are probably going to have to let Malice go off because they just aren't able to fit in the adequate number of non-engine with how big their engine is. Outside of that though, like, this deck is still pretty scary, I think, as a rogue deck, and every time I play against it, I feel like a sense of dread if my deck loses to Darklaw, for example, because the deck can just cheat out Darklaw super easily as well. Next up is Pendulum. I don't really have a very specific Pendulum deck in mind, but I think in general, most Pendulum slop decks are probably just okay for locals. Like, I'm sure going first, there are some pretty nasty end boards you could set up. I think Pendulum also just suffers from the same issues as just not being able to go second, but also just inherently playing a weaker engine than like some combo decks like Heroes and Plants, which may have a similar issue. You have to see like very specific combinations of them in order to put up like a big board most of the time. So I think that Pendulum is probably just going to be a deck that's like okay for locals. It's confident enough to play there at least. Next up is Chimera. I also think Chimera, like Evil Twin, is a deck that can compete with the metagame. It's able to take advantage of the Feast with engine as a part of its regular combo, and it has very layered disruptions when it's able to go first and set up. My biggest problem with Chimera is that it's not able to necessarily play the most number of non-engine, and plus, as a fusion deck, there are going to be hands where you just see like clunky materials that you can't get out unless you have access to a fusion spell. So you're sort of bottlenecked by the fact that you do need like fusion spells in order to really get this deck's engine going. And even though it does have a ton of access to those fusion spells, a savvy opponent is going to know that, oh hey, if I'm able to cut them off of seeing those fusion spells, the deck just isn't able to do too much. But despite all that, I do think that Chimera is powerful enough and consistent enough to compete with like the top decks out there right now. Next up is Odeon. I think that Odeon is a deck that's like probably maybe close to the bottom of fine for regionals. Like, I don't really like these types of trap decks. I just feel like they just don't do anything when they go second. But I guess Odeon is something that could work because they are able to splash the Fiendsmith engine in there, and the Fiendsmith engine itself is just good enough to even carry some decks like this into being a very competent deck. So overall, I think that Odeon itself without Fiendsmith is probably something more of a locals deck, but if you put Fiendsmith in it, it probably can do decently well at a regional level in my opinion. Next up is Vanquish Soul, and this is Vanquish Soul before we get the new support. Keep in mind, so I think that Vanquish Soul before any new support is probably a deck that's like fine for locals. Not too impressed with what the deck can do at the moment before they get any of their new cards. It just feels like the deck doesn't do anything super unfairly. And it does force you to deck build in a very specific way where you have like the appropriate attributes. It may force you to play like some maybe less than optimal cards in your deck just because they match like the attribute requirement for the Vanquish Soul monsters. So until we get the new support, I think it's probably a deck that will only do decently at a local level. Next up is Millennium. I'm not too impressed with this deck, just not even worth considering for at a competitive level. The fact that you have to play 5 bricks in your deck in the Exodia pieces is already a pretty big dire warning sign for me, in my opinion. And I think no matter how you build this deck, it just doesn't really do enough. Like if you go first, the most you're setting up is like the Exodia spell and trap negate, and then maybe like one of the traps to like blow up your opponent's board, which can be decent, but I think that most opponents know that the only way you're getting there is through Millennium Ankh, and once again, savvy players can like just try to cut you off of Millennium Ankh and you won't be able to do anything. Well, and if you do try to build this deck in a way where you try to go second in OTK your opponents, you're letting them set up their entire board most of the time, and in the upcoming format, I don't think the engine is not going to be close to good enough to actually be able to break through and OTK your opponent. So I think that Millennium's just not super good in my opinion. Next up is Melodious. I think Melodious is also probably a deck that's like fine for regionals. It's able to play a decent number of non-engine. Its end board can be pretty annoying for some decks to out with a card like Arya and Etoile being able to sort of dodge any effects that would like threaten the Melodious monsters, and Arya is just sort of impossible for most decks to out outside of Malice. I think the fact that Malice is able to out Melodious's main end board just makes it so Melodious will probably struggle in that matchup a lot, and for that reason I can't really put it any higher than fine for regionals. It just won't have a great Malice matchup in my opinion, but outside of that matchup it's probably fine into most other decks as well. Next up is True Draco. I think that True Draco is a deck that's like not very good. I want to put it at like Stay Home instead, but just because of how powerful Floodgates can be still, even against the top decks, I'll probably put it at fine for locals. The deck probably will need to play a bunch of Floodgates in order to be able to compete, and it will need to be able to go first because this deck just isn't doing anything when they're going second. Masterpiece isn't what it used to be as well. Like even if the deck doesn't have a spell or trap out right away, they can simply just run it over most of the time. True Draco just doesn't really have anything going for it as like a stun deck, and Masterpiece is definitely not enough to really bring it back to competitive viability in my opinion. Next up is Exosister. I think that Exosister is unfortunately not very good. Their main interruptions just aren't going to do anything to a deck like Malice because Malice just doesn't care about having their cards banished. Not to mention, Exosister just feels really bad going second as well. You're forced to see like a ton of non-engine in order to be able to even compete with your opponents, and a lot of the times just feels like there's so many bricks with like the normal level 4 monsters that aren't Martha, and for that reason I just don't think Exosister's a great deck at the moment. There aren't any like super great matchups for the deck to take advantage of like there was back in Cheerlement format, for example. Next up is Mimighoul. I think Mimighoul is probably a deck that's like fine for locals. The deck does have a pretty nasty lock that they can do with Mimighoul Dungeon and with their trap card, where they can essentially make it so your opponent can't normal summon, and a lot of decks just won't have very easy access to spell or trap removal, so I think that could lock out some opponents from playing, which is interesting. But ultimately, Dominus Impulse is going to be a very commonly played card by Malice, and Dominus Impulse, for those of you who don't know against the Mimighoul deck, makes it so the controller can't activate any Earth effects, and all the Mimighouls are Earth, so that means every time you give your opponent a Mimighoul and it flips up, it can't activate its effect. It'll essentially just have given them a free body to link off with. It's a very interesting like control deck, but I just don't think it's going to be able to do anything outside of like a local environment. Next up is Pearly. I think that Pearly is also something that's like okay for locals. X-Pearly Noir can be pretty annoying for some decks to out, but I just feel like this deck is going to have some trouble with just using its engine when going second. For those of you who don't know, Pearly has a bunch of quick play spells to summon out like their level 1 cats from the deck, and those cats will try to like rank up by like using a quick play spell. but there's going to be so much removal in this upcoming format between like Malice playing cards like Firewall Dragon and the Cryptor, and even a deck like Rise is going to have Detonator, which can just blow up the little monsters every time they try to use their effect. So I think it might almost be nearly impossible for this deck to go second, and even going first, it's not like its end boards are unbreakable with the Expertly Noir. It'll be solid, but I don't think it'll really be good enough to compete outside of a locals level in my opinion. Next up is Tier Element. I think that Tier Element is probably a deck that I would put at like fine for regionals. I actually think that with like the right amount of luck, this deck can almost play through anything. Like you just have infinite extenders from like the graveyard. You have a lot of very good standalone powerful cards like the Imseti and the rest of the Horus engine that technically can have almost infinite extenders as long as your mills are good. So I think that while there is a lot of luck required with the Tier Element deck to do well, it does have the potential to break boards when going second with just engine alone, and going first it can set up some pretty nasty end boards if you're able to mill nice as well. But ultimately I don't think it's a deck that can consistently compete just because of how big the luck element is. If your mills are bad or you just draw a pretty clunky hand in your over 40 card deck, it's going to be pretty hard to really do much with the deck in general. Next up is Voiceless Voice. I think Voiceless Voice is a okay deck. It's able to play okay number of non-engine. Its end board is fine. It can consistently get to its end board most of the time, but I just feel like its end board just isn't going to be enough to really hold back a deck like Malice. And in general, it's the type of deck to where you're not really doing too much. You're just sort of setting up like your basic one negate plus like a pop maybe with like a bunch of follow-up, and that can be good in like slower matchups or against decks of a lower power level, but I don't think this deck's going to be able to do that well against like the super heavy combo decks like Mouse. Next up is Unchained. I think that Unchained is probably something that's like okay for regionals. It is able to take advantage of the Feasmith engine, and the Unchained cards are still pretty annoying for a deck like Ryzeal to deal with as well, because you can't really do anything to pop them. But Unchained is just going to struggle into Mouse like most of these other decks will because of the banishing removal. It does hurt Unchained quite a bit, and not to mention Unchained itself isn't the most consistent deck either. Most of their combos are 2-card combos, and that means they're going to have to find the right balance between playing enough hand traps to stop the opponent, as well as seeing enough engine to consistently be able to play the game. Unchained for the most part is just going to be meh. Like it'll be fine at a regionals level, but I don't think it'll do anything past that. Next up is Runic. I think that Runic is just okay for locals, similar to True Draco. There are going to be games where they just see a bunch of floodgates and it'll shut out pretty much any deck out there, but it's not really doing anything going second. And against like the Malice deck, the Runic engine itself can just give them a million extenders and follow up as well. So I don't think that Runic's gonna have that many great matchups in this upcoming format. As a stun deck though, like there are going to be games where you just outright win because your opponent has no out to your floodgate, but what happens when you go second with the deck is just not really possible in my opinion. You will have to very specifically see cards like Sphere Mode and then see like the exact right floodgates to actually be able to lock your opponent out. So I think a lot has to go right for this deck to do well. So for that reason, I'll probably put it as like fine for locals, and that's it. Next up is Azamina Snake Eyes, and this is interesting because they did get back Poplar and Ash to 2 in our most recent ban list, although they did lose to Bonfire. I do want to say though that this Azamina stuff has constantly been getting new support, and even Snake Eyes cards have been getting new support like in their fusion monster as well. So I think that there's some potential for experimentation with this deck. I don't think there's a reason to play this over another combo deck like Malice, for example, but there's some merit to like experimenting with it in my opinion, just because of how much new support Konami has given to the Azamina and the Snake Eyes cards. Maybe there's some way you can put these cards together to form a very competent combo deck. And I think that for that reason, this deck probably is going to do fine at a regional level. Next up are Dinos. I think Dinos is like an okay deck for locals. It can set up some pretty nasty boards when going first. Going second, maybe it has some potential to break boards naturally with like part of its engine because it's able to access Pankratops very easily. But I don't think that Dinos are going to be consistent enough or powerful enough to compete with a lot of these other decks, even a lot of these other decks in the tier above it. So I think that I can't really put it at anything higher than fine for locals. Drytron's interesting. It can be a very scary combo deck, and I think it'll probably fall in a similar boat as like Plants and like other combo decks where they just have a very large engine that's good at going first and putting up their end board, but going second may just struggle at breaking boards. And especially with Drytron, they also sort of get caught in the crossfire with like Bystials as well being in the format, and Droll is probably going to be running around everywhere. So I don't think that Drytron's going to have too great of a time for the most part. So I'll probably just put it near like the bottom of fine for regionals for now. It is still a scary combo deck, but there are enough cards that people are going to be playing anyways that are going to be able to consistently stop it. Next up is Flu. I think that Flu is not a very good deck at all right now, especially with Shifter down to 1. It does lose one of its biggest win conditions. Empen is an annoying card, but a lot of the time Flu is just going to end up losing to itself because of its lack of consistency. It really only has like 3 Robina as like its pure 1-card starters, and most people know that, like, oh hey, if I'm able to stop their normal summon, and they're not going to be able to do anything for the most part. It just doesn't function that well in my opinion right now. Sky Striker I think is probably a deck that's like okay for locals. There are enough like good going second board breakers to where it has the potential to break through some end boards. I don't think it's breaking through the Malice end board, but there are going to be some decks to where this deck can like sweep it aside with like board breakers like Lightning Storm, Thrust, and things of that nature. It just feels like a worse going second deck than Tenpai though, in my opinion. So if you do want to play a going second deck, Tenpai is probably the way to go. But if you do like your Sky Striker strategy, then I think it's probably a deck that can do well at a locals level at least. Next up is Bestial Control. This falls in a similar boat as Dragon Link. I think it's probably going to be okay. Doesn't really do enough in my opinion because the Bestials aren't good enough hand traps in this upcoming format. So it sort of falls into the same boat as Dragon Link in my opinion. Decent access to generic Dragon Toolbox, and it is able to play a decent number of non-engine, but unfortunately I just don't think that its engine is going to be powerful enough to keep up with the metagame. Next up is Vanadium. I think that Vanadium is interesting. If you've seen like Triff's videos, he loves like cooking stuff with this deck. I think that the Vanadium engine is fine. It's still fairly powerful. You're able to generate a ton of bodies and advantage out onto the field. I do think that shoving in supplementary engines like Fiendsmith and Azamina do help the deck out a decent amount. So for that reason, I'll probably put it at like the bottom of fine for regionals. It just feels like one of those combo decks to where like, hey, cool, if you go first, you're probably going to win, but what happens when you go second? It's not like this deck has the best answers in engine to going second, although it does probably have leg up over some of these other decks at least, because it does play cards like Fenrir as part of its normal engine and can play a okay number of non-engine cards outside of that as well. Next up is Plunder Patrol. I think that this deck is probably going to be okay for locals. It just feels a little bit too slow and a little bit too fair. It doesn't really end on anything too crazy, and I think a lot of decks are just going to be able to blow past this end board. But in maybe a slower format like a locals format, it could probably do fine. Next up is Rescue Ace. I think that Rescue Ace is also a deck that's like okay for locals. Turbulence Set 4 is still powerful enough if you're able to get to it, but I don't think this deck's going to be able to consistently get access to it that much. And not to mention, even if the deck is able to successfully resolve Turbulence, I don't think that it's going to be impossible for most meta decks to simply break through it with their regular engine. So I think that this deck is a little bit outdated at this point. While it is able to play engines like Fiendsmith and take advantage of generic fire extra deck toolbox stuff like Princess, I just don't think the power level of this deck's going to be high enough to really compete past the local level right now. And finally, we have Thunder Dragon. I think Thunder Dragon's also, as like a pure deck, is probably just going to be fine for locals. Colossus can be very solid against some decks, but against a deck like Malice, they're not really going to fold under a card like Colossus. So I don't think that Thunder Dragon's regular end board is going to be able to do enough against some meta decks. Colossus is still a great card, don't get me wrong, and can completely shut out a lot of these decks on this list, but I feel like this deck is going to suffer from similar problems as I've repeated many times on this tier list. The deck just probably isn't going to be able to go second. Like, going first, if it sets up its end board, cool, you'll be able to floodgate out and shut out a couple of decks. But going second, it probably just isn't going to be able to do too much. But that's going to do it for this tier list. Let me know what you guys thought about it in the comment section below. Do you think there's any, like, super cool rogue decks I missed or any important rogue decks that I missed? Let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know if you think that any of these decks could realistically compete in this upcoming Alliance Inside format. Or do you think that decks like Malice and Ryzel are just going to be the only ones that are viable? I hope you guys enjoyed the video once again, and if you did, I just want to remind you guys to please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video so YouTube knows that you enjoyed this type of content, and you'll help keep me motivated to keep posting more videos like this in the future. Before I sign out, I just want to give a quick shout out to Your Playmat and CardTrader as well. You can sign up for them using my affiliate links in the description below and use code Tcg Sam to get 5% off your entire order. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching once again, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.